the opportunity. And my understanding for time is that you'd like to keep this in about 15 minutes. Is that right, Bill?
Yeah, I think that would be good. And, you know, we'll have some time to discuss it as well. So.
Absolutely.
Oh, shit.
Hello?
All right.
So one of the things is that, and since I'm screen sharing at the moment, we have a lot of information available on this. So if there's something you want to read up on afterwards, you're welcome to contact me with questions, but there's also lots of material. And it's nice and easy to find. It's just the NYISO.com/carbon pricing, all in one word. So what I thought I would do is walk you through what our carbon pricing proposal is. Is this big enough and visible to you all? Or should I make it a little bigger?
It seems good to me, Nicole. Would you like to introduce yourself a bit in terms of what your role is at the ISO?
I'm so sorry, yes. So my name is Nicole Bouchez. I'm the principal economist for market design at the New York ISO. I have been there about 18 years, I think, at this point. I used to be the market monitor and then went into market design. Recently, a while back, I did a lot of capacity market design. More recently, in sort of the last 4 years, carbon pricing and preparing the grid for the future in New York has been really my focus. So we've been doing a lot of work on how, what is the grid of the future going to look like, but also what market rules do we need in order to support reliability in the future? And then also, how do we modify rules to really integrate these new technologies in ways that make sense? So that's been the real focus the last few years. But I'm going to talk about, oh, I'm sorry.
No, I was just saying thank you.
Oh, no problem. I do apologize. So today, what I wanted to do was just, at Joanne's suggestion, was introduce you to the carbon pricing and what we've done in carbon pricing and how that fits in with other proposals now that are on the board, right? And also talk about what that means to consumers, because we've actually done a lot of work on the consumer impact of these. The carbon pricing, the proposal is one for just the energy markets, the wholesale energy markets. And the idea here is that is the realm that we have control over. Now, and the idea here at the highest level is there's this nice little infographic that we have, but basically what it is that New York State would set a cost of carbon for the wholesale electricity markets. And that would be per ton of emitted CO2. The power plants would do their normal generation and they would pay based on their actual smokestack emissions. Because of that, right, they would also have to include that in their pricing, and we would get a rational dispatch where the more emitting generators would be more costly than the less emitting, and the renewable non-emitting generators would be cheapest of all and even cheaper, right, relative to fossil. What that means is that you end up with an incentive to invest in low carbon or carbon-free generation, but also an investment, right, in incremental improvements in emissions in existing fleet. Now, this is not the fleet that we're going to have in 2040, right? This is really a what do we have now and where are we going as we start to phase out these emitting generators. We want to make sure that we are incenting the most emitting generators to leave faster and the less emitting, CO2 emitting generators to stay longer. Now, what's interesting about this is that in all the studies that we've done, and have been done not just internally, but by very reputable consultants, the consumers benefit from this, because this is all, how do you most efficiently implement the state policy? And one of the real benefits, and I'm an economist, right, about this, is that you get the proper price signal. So what you end up having is that renewables locate closer to loads and on the correct side of constraints, right? Renewables are going to want to locate where the prices are higher, and that is actually where they are offsetting the most carbon dioxide emissions. And that's the important part. There are also public health impacts. There are carbon prices will really change urban pricing, and that is where the most emitting some of the most emitting generation is. And it's also where the larger populations are in close contact with those emissions. So what I've talked about is this accelerated entry of clean resources, increased revenue streams for renewable resources, and health. Now, I know Joanne mentioned that there was a lot of interest in, and I always get the name wrong, it's the Climate and Community Investment Act, the CCIA. And I'm sorry, I don't remember what the Senate bill number is, because it's proposing, for example, a fee on carbon dioxide emissions. Now, our proposal actually works with that very well, and it would also work really well with a national carbon tax, should one be imposed, because the New York State social cost of carbon that is set, right? The way that we anticipate and have written the rules for that is that it would be net of any other state or federal carbon charge or tax. So the idea here is, if the state said, well, we want the energy sector, right, the wholesale energy sector to have say $30 per ton of CO2, if there is a statewide tax, for example, of $15, we would only impose the difference between those two. So the idea here was to have a proposal that really plays well with a system that's in transition as we go along, especially since we don't know what's going to happen. Now, one of the big questions we always get is, okay, NYISO, you collect this money, right, from the CO2 emissions, based on CO2 emissions. What do you do with it? Well, what we do with it is we return it directly to consumers. So the wholesale consumers and customers are the ones who will get the money back. So that's one of the big differences with a carbon tax. Governments collect taxes. And in our case, we call it a carbon charge, because what we're proposing is that we impose this fee, and then that fee is returned to consumers directly. That's the highlights. Any questions or any direction you'd like me to go on this?
What's the next step? I mean, what's the process of getting this approved, and how long would it take to implement?
Oh, excellent question. So I'm going to go down. There's a nice little timeline on this little sheet that I went to. I think I sent it around. So we've been working on this since 2017, believe it or not. And it's taken a long time to sort of talk through all the different parts of this. Where we are currently is that we have the rules sort of put together in a proposal. And the next step is really that if the New York State and the stakeholders in our process, because we're self-governing, right? So we have a committee and a stakeholder process, just like many other bodies. If the state supports moving forward with this, we would then go to our stakeholders, our board of directors, and then it would go to the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission for a decision. That's who our primary we're primarily jurisdictional to. There has been indications that the current FERC committee is actually very interested in potentially having this come in front of it. We get questions a lot from some of the commissioners and from their staff primarily. And the state would then, and that would go through that process. And then in a parallel, we anticipate sort of a parallel path would be the state deciding what the social cost of carbon they want to use in the New York State energy markets would be. And then once we have decisions from both of those areas, we would just implement it. The implementation would probably take a little while just because those processes are not the fastest. But we actually have been anticipating this. So we have a lot of the software changes have been worked on, the requirements and things like that. We haven't started coding because that's sort of jumping the gun a bit, but we have all the requirements and things like that we've been working through. It's probably also worth mentioning sort of some of the entities who support this. We have supports from the League of Conservation Voters, the IBEW Local 97, the AWEA, the American Wind Association, the Alliance for Clean Energy, New York, and others. And I think you've probably seen recently there's a coalition has formed itself to help support this. And so, any other questions?
Yeah, can I ask,
Hey,
Bob?
Bob.
Yeah, I've participated in the meetings, all the way back to 2017 and been following this as it goes along. And I've been consistently concerned that a carbon charge adopted in one small part of the overall energy market, while other parts of the energy market don't have such charges, in essence ends up producing unintended consequences. The key impact being that we're in the process of trying to encourage beneficial electrification, but anything that increases the price of electricity relative to oil or gas, for instance, as a heating solution, tends to hinder our ability to convince people to use electrification. Now, I realize that the obvious response is, oh, well, we're going to give the money back. The difficulty is that means that there's a good bit of accounting that has to go on, that rates will be set at an amount which assumes the actual costs, and then at some point later there may be compensation provided by returning the money. But whatever the case, it ends up looking like it will have an impact on the relative cost of electricity versus oil or gas.
Mm-hmm.
And I agree with many people that carbon taxes and carbon charges in general are a good idea, but it's very concerning that we would essentially only have a partial carbon charge, only on one particular source of fuel, not on all of them together. Now, let me just say finally, sorry, not trying to make this long, but you guys have done wonderful work on how you would do a carbon charge for electricity. Okay, that's great. The problem is it's only electricity. How do we avoid unintended consequences?
No, I think I came into these discussions and 4 years ago with sort of some of the same concerns. I think what we've seen though is that it isn't a case where you're choosing a carbon charge and the alternative is to do nothing, for example. or a carbon tax, and the alternative is to do nothing. Remembering that we have the CLCPA that is going to require achievement of these goals. And if they're done through, through the existing programs, or if they're done through the existing programs augmented by a carbon price, that's where the difference is. I think, unfortunately, we are going to pay for the CLCPA, right? And for the investments needed, no matter what. The question is that going to be done efficiently and at least cost? And what we believe is that having a carbon charge in the New York markets will help get us to that least cost. There is let me see if I have it on here.
Well, you're looking for that. The problem here is, though, that we're going to have to pay for the CLCPA, but what's being suggested here is that the electric customers and potentially the adopters of beneficial electrification who are doing what we want them to do, they are going to have to pay, while the oil and gas users do not pay, because they aren't being charged a carbon charge or carbon fee, and they still get billions of dollars in subsidies for the fuel that we don't want people to be using. So yeah, we have to pay, but why is it that the people that are doing the right thing are the ones that are being asked to pay instead of everyone, or the people who are doing the wrong thing?
So I'd like to follow that up with a personal experience. I'm on Long Island. One of the dirtiest power plants in the state is in my town. And so, and I have a geothermal heating and cooling system. And this means I'm going to be paying a whole lot more for my geothermal system because of this tax, because of where it's very polluting. And why my concern, just stepping back, why my concern is when this starts is in 2023, we expect the wind turbines to start generating electricity, in which case we'll be able to close down these plants. But that's a 3-year time when I may be really suffering because I'm paying so much more because I'm using more, but I'm using it efficiently and I have no greenhouse gases going up my chimney. So this is exactly it. The people who've done the right thing and have converted to electrification with a geothermal or air source heat pump are going to be paying more when we're already doing the right thing. And it's going to be really hard to convince people to leave their oil and gas to go to all electric system because they're going to be paying so much more. In other words, right now, it's sort of almost even whether you go with gas or with geothermal. Once we do this, it's going to make us less competitive, and that's working against what we need people to do. We really need to get everyone off burning gas and oil and having fumes go up their chimney and get them on electrification. And I think after that, I think it might work better, especially on Long Island, because we will have all that clean wind power coming in. But this 2-year gap between right now and when we expect it to go online, unless you don't think it's going to happen by then, is going to be real tricky for us. And for me in particular, I'm going to be paying a whole lot more for doing the right thing. And that doesn't seem to be right.
Billy,
So-
thanks for that. Before Nicole answers, I wanted to point out there were a few people who have been using the chat to kind of get in line. And if I could ask that we can do that, if you want to say something in this discussion, just put the word chat in the, or stack, I mean, in the chat, and then we'll get to you. And at this point, we've got Lisa and Mark in the chat. I'd like to hear Nicole respond to what Billy said, and then let's go to Lisa. Thanks.
No, thank you very much. I mean, I think these are real concerns. First of all, I do have good news, is that a lot of the wind is coming on, the land-based wind is on its way in and increasing. And we have a huge number of interconnection projects, both with offshore and onshore. So it's not a cliffhanger at 2023. It's really going to be a gradual ramping up of these clean resources. Now, the thing to remember is that these resources are part of the state's programs, and those are already in your bills, right? And so the question is going forward, as the state continues to incent more clean resources, is that done solely with the existing procurement processes, or is that done also with the economic signals that a carbon charge can give? And what we have looked at is said, is there a benefit to consumers? Is the overall cost of the, going to come down with adding a carbon charge, or is it not going to make a difference? And what we found, and what there's a nice sheet that talks about, here, let me get it for you. The analysis group key findings one. So the analysis group is an economic consulting firm. And what they found is that it reduced overall consumer cost. So the question, right, is you have different categories in your bill. Is the overall bill going to come down? Because it does matter. Exactly. You're entirely right, right? As we go towards switching away from fossil fuels, it's a combination of policies that are going to drive that. And making sure that we pay the least for it is important because it matters to individuals and to households. So I don't have a perfect answer that all of a sudden I'm going to be able to make fossil fuels look horribly expensive, right? I can't impose a carbon charge or a carbon tax on those fossil fuels. The state can, and the federal government can, and they're working on that. But in the meantime, we think that there's real value to implementing something that we know will help consumers, and more to the point, will help us transition to that cleaner future.
All right, let's hear from Lisa.
Hi, thanks, Nicole, for a great presentation. My question, well, I have now several, but my initial question was, is the leaked methane from natural gas, the CO2e of the leaked methane included in the pricing, or is it just the stack emissions? Because if it's not yeah, go ahead.
No, I'm sorry, Lisa, go ahead if you still have other.
I'm saying if it's not included, then it would obviously favor new natural gas power plants to be built.
It's a great question. We talked about it extensively because of some of those concerns. Is it overall emissions or stack? We settled on a stack emissions because that's what we can measure very easily with respect to power generation plants, right? It's already data that is collected because it's reported to the EPA and to the DEC. There are clearly other consequences to different fuels, but at least we're capturing the carbon dioxide emissions from the burning of the fuel. So I would say it's not overall the first best if you're concerned about overall emissions, but it is a very solid second best.
Yeah, I would say it's safe to say I'm concerned about all emissions. The second question is, I understand how the hourly reverse auction value stack that you do now works. So all the renewables and nuclear are bidding in at zero to start out with. And then everyone gets the price that the last bidder bid at, right? And so I guess the real issue about pricing in the current system is peaking. So I feel like, and the peaker plants are usually the most polluting. So I feel like focusing on evening out the grid so you avoid those peaks would actually be perhaps more beneficial to everybody. So to add the carbon pricing to that, is it like a handicap that's figured in after the hourly reverse auction, or is this going to replace the reverse auction, or how does it actually work?
Great question. I usually talk about that as being a uniform clearing price auction. So you're exactly right. You stack up essentially just like you do when you clear any commodity. You stack up, you purchase the cheaper ones first, and it's when you get to the last one that sets the price. So the idea is that what you will see is that power plants will include the cost of this carbon charge in their offers. So if you had two power plants with the same, who before had, say, the same fuel costs, let's call it that, their efficiency, their heat rate was the same, but one was more emitting than the other. It's a little odd, but they will reorder themselves so that we won't get to the most emitting ones as soon, and we will use the cheaper and hence the less emitting ones first.
Okay.
So that's the benefit there.
Sort of already does happen more or less in the existing system, is the way I understand it. Especially, I mean, obviously because nuclear and renewable and solar and wind go in, well, and hydro.
It
are
absolutely
in
does in terms of like resource class is what I would call it to a great extent, right? So you're right. The wind and solar and nuclear are taken first. But remember that what you were particularly concerned about the peaking times, right? When things are tight and we do have to use fossil. And the question there is, what fossils do we use? And anything we can do to even differentiate between fossils at those times is really helpful, right? Because even if we can, even if we still need fossil for those few megawatts in the evening peak, it'd be better if we could use the less emitting fossils over the more emitting fossils. And that's essentially what the carbon pricing does. It helps reinforce that ordering.
Nicole, my last thing is really just a comment, but you said that there's a lot of land-based wind coming on the grid, and that is exactly the opposite of my lived experience. In fact, my understanding is that land-based wind is not being built in New York, and that the developers are not even interested in trying to develop land-based wind in New York because the community opposition has been so well organized. So I just wanted to make that comment. You don't have to respond to it if you don't want to, but my understanding from my friends in the grid scale solar and wind development industry is that land-based wind is basically dead in New York State.
If I send Bill and Joanne the numbers of what we're seeing coming on the grid, Bill, would you be willing to distribute that? Because I don't know them off the top of my head. They change too fast.
Yeah. And I think with the new siting procedure that's in place, we're seeing an uptick at this point. So why don't we go to Mark's question?
Sure.
Sure. So I was I heard you say that that there wasn't going to be pancaking if there were a federal carbon charge or something like that. How does this play in with local law 97? And have you guys, kind of worked through that in what would happen to folks in New York City if they were paying for carbon there?
Local law 97 is a little different because it's not a tax as far or a carbon charge as I understand it. It has, so we have talked somewhat. I don't have a lot of information on local law 97 and what the implementation. So the issue is, I think, more how it's implemented. And as far as and maybe you can help me because I haven't followed it maybe in the last 8 or 9 months. Has there been any movement on how it's going to be implemented?
I don't have an answer for that. I just keyed off the fact that you said that it was not going to pancake with federal stuff, and I was kind of thinking to myself, well, local law 97 might have some interesting impacts here on driving behavior. And
I apologize, Mark, I'm not completely up to date on that one anymore.
No worries, I'm not either, so I can't even ask a smart question, but thank you.
No problem. And by the way, it wouldn't pancake with state rates either.
Okay, right.
But we explicitly did not include sort of like a city rate or something like that, just because of how quickly those things can move. And it wasn't clear to us that there was a lot of value.
Okay. Thank you.
Let's hear from Ron.
Thanks a lot, Bill, and thanks, Nicole. I agree with Bob that that first of all, great job and analysis and a lot of great work, and really, you know, you can see years of dedication and stuff. I guess first, I agree with you that once we cleanly electrify the grid and electrify everything, and that's specifically gas for our vehicles and other forms of transportation, and how we heat and cool our buildings, as well as how we electrify the grid, the consumers will see a net savings. Totally agree. That's exactly what all the numbers say across the country. It's trillions of dollars of savings when we cleanly electrify everything. So agree with you on that part. The part that I'm really concerned about is one part where you said that the renewables need to be close to the load. And in New York, we have this like really sort of strange load where most of our load is in New York City and Long Island. And I think the percentage, do you know, I'm not sure what the percentage is. We can ask Bob. Bob will know, somebody will know. But anyway, large percentages. You don't know what that percentage is either, right?
Not off the top of my head.
Yeah, so that's an issue in New York because we have to get the renewables from around into that load, right? And part of it's going to come now from offshore wind, which is great, massive 10,000, 20,000 megawatts out there just waiting to be grabbed, which we're about to do, which is wonderful. That's one phase that's got to come in. That phase, though, has to come in too with shifts in transportation and in heating and cooling. And I also agree with Bob and Billy that like you need to do a whole sector, otherwise you're penalizing those people who are going first and leading the way with clean electrification solutions. So that's one piece I have to say, I believe for me anyway, I can't agree with a carbon tax on the way you structured it. I really need to see that across the board for transportation fuels and for all building and heatings, and that it needs to be a fair and simple system. Because the other thing is people, I'd like you to talk about the yellow jackets, because the yellow jackets in France were kind of what spurred a lot of this anti-carbon tax stuff. So maybe you could address that. So thank you very much.
You're welcome. So I think there's several things I'd like to respond to. First of all, I love your reference to the yellow jackets because I am actually French. Probably none of you know this, but I actually am fluent in French and have a French passport as well. So yeah, now in terms of the savings, I want to be just clear that our work doesn't just show that there's benefits in the long run to this proposal. It's that there are short run benefits, and by short run I mean within the next 2 to 5 years, because it is more specific in the incentives for where renewables should be locating. And I agree with you, it's not just locating right next to New York City. One of the problems we have in the electric grid is that, and engineers talk about the fact that New York is not copper plated, right? A copper plate means you can connect to anywhere and not have any problems. What we have is a transmission system, right? And a transmission system that was built with a very particular mix of resources in mind. And it's a transmission system that allows a lot to come from upstate down to New York City, but it doesn't allow as much as we will need to come from upstate into New York City, because there is going to be a substantial additional resources. So the question is can you locate some of those resources, and maybe it's solar resources, on the load side of those constraints a little bit more than you would have but for.
So, and I totally agree with you, and then I'm going to pass it over to the next person because I'm sure everybody wants to have a additional conversation with you. But the two pieces that I'd like to respond to that is that solar and wind in upstate New York are starting to go up, would go up in a big way, but there's a tremendous amount of community opposition to it. So that's one challenge that needs to be dealt with, and it's a massive challenge. That's one piece, and doing what you're saying to do would help that a bit, but not really. What I think really New York City's Local Law 97 does is kind of an interesting solution, because it puts a carbon tax, a greenhouse gas penalty if you don't hit certain milestones per square foot of space. Don't hit those milestones, you get penalized. I have one client, it's about basically 50 cents a square foot, somewhere around there, and it adds up really quickly. So that approach to buildings, and then an additional approach that deals with fuel and with the need for resources outside of your local area. As much as possible local, great, but New York City and Long Island, basically you'd have to have it from offshore and you have to have it from upstate. And the transmission is a key component, as is the integration. So I'll leave it like that. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your question.
Okay,
Bill,
so we do have more on the agenda. There's two other folks on stack, Billy and myself, and I think I'd like to limit it to that if we could at this point, and then move on. So Billy?
I'll give my time. I forgot what the question was now, to somebody else.
Okay. So Nicole, I just wanted to say that we have looked at this and have been supplying comments from the very beginning, and I'm not hearing anything today that really changes the position that New York Geo has taken in these things, which is we do need an economy-wide carbon charge. You know, at this point in Western New York, electricity is 4.5 times more expensive than gas, and that needs to be narrowed, and some of the bit with gas has to do with subsidies it gets along the line. But to add costs to electricity, even though I understand what you're saying about it eventually reducing the costs, is just not right when we're trying to electrify things. And I'm wondering, we keep wondering if we've been heard at all in this process when we've made this point. Has NYISO at all looked at trying to do this on an economy-wide basis? I know your jurisdiction is not past the electric system, but have you tried to patch something together that would take it economy-wide?
So we are a 401c3 company, or not-for-profit, to be very clear. And so we don't lobby for changes in laws and government. What we do is provide information. So we've been trying to provide as much transparent information as possible in terms of what's going on, and what the proposals are and what the existing system looks like. I think I can assure you that we have heard that concern. The difficulty for us is that, is there room for something until we get to your first best solution? And we think that the carbon pricing is actually a very sound proposal in anticipation of getting there. Now, if your only concern is the relative price of natural gas versus electricity, it won't address that. But if your concern is overall emissions as well as that, then you may want to consider it, because it will impact overall emissions as well.
Okay, well, thanks much for coming today and for presenting the information and for all the work you've done. Why don't we move along at this point in the agenda? And Nicole, you're welcome to stick with us, or I'm sure you're busy with other stuff as well. It's entirely up to you.
I'm going to jump off, but thank you again, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
So Bob, could you talk for a minute about what you see in the TRM filing that came in today, if you've had a chance to read it? Just quickly.